All right, chapter 5. Animadversions on some of the writers who have rendered women objects of pity, bordering on contempt. The opinions speciously supported in some modern publications on the female character and education, which have given the tone to most of the observations made in a more cursory manner on the sex, remain now to be examined. Section 1. I shall begin, as returning readers may guess, with Rousseau, and give a sketch of his character of woman. In his own words, interspersing comments and reflections. My comments, it is true, will all spring from a few simple principles, and might have been deduced from what I have already said. But the artificial structure has been raised with so much ingenuity that it seems necessary to attack it in a more circumstantial manner, and make the application myself. Sophia, says Rousseau, should be as perfect a woman as Emilius is a man, and to render her so, it is necessary to examine the character which nature has given to the sex. He then proceeds to prove that woman ought to be weak and passive, because she has less bodily strength than man, and hence infers that she was formed to please and to be subject to him. And hence and that it is her duty to render herself agreeable to her master, this being the grand end of her existence. Still, however, to give a little mock dignity to lust, he insists that man should not exert his strength, but depend on the will of the woman when he seeks for pleasure with her. Hence we deduce, quote, hence we deduce a third consequence from the different constitutions of the sexes, which is that the strongest should be master in appearance, and be dependent in fact on the weakest, and that not from any frivolous practice of gallantry or vanity of protectorship, but from an invariable law of nature, which, furnishing woman with a greater facility to excite desires than she has given man to satisfy them, makes the latter dependent on the good pleasure of the former, and compels him to endeavor to please in his turn in order to obtain her consent that he should be the strongest. There's a footnote. What nonsense is the footnote? It could have been in text probably, but on these occasions, the most delightful circumstance a man finds in his victory, is to doubt whether it was the woman's weakness that yielded to his superior strength, or whether her inclinations spoke in his favor. The females are also generally artful enough to leave this matter in doubt. The understanding of women... Birdie, can you please get down? The understanding of women answers in this respect perfectly to their constitution. So far from being ashamed of their weakness, they glory in it. Their tender muscles make no resistance. They affect to be incapable of lifting the smallest burthens, and would blush to be thought robust and strong. To what purpose is all this? Not merely for the sake of appearing delicate, but through an artful precaution. It is thus they provide an excuse beforehand, and a right to be feeble when they think it expedient. I have quoted this passage lest my readers should suspect that I warp the author's reasoning to support my own arguments. I have already asserted that in educating women, these fundamental principles lead to a system of cunning and lasciviousness. Supposing woman to have been formed only to please and be subject to man, the conclusion is just. She ought to sacrifice every other consideration to render herself agreeable to him, and let his brutal desire of self-preservation be the grand spring of all her actions, when it is proved to be the iron bed of fate, to fit which her character should be stretched or contracted, regardless of all moral or physical distinctions. But if, as I think may be demonstrated, the purposes of even this life, viewing the whole, be subverted by practical rules built upon this ignoble base, I may be allowed to doubt whether women were created for man. And though the cry of irreligion or even atheism be raised against me, I will simply declare that were an angel from heaven to tell me that Moses' beautiful poetical cosmogony and the account of the fall of man were literally true, I could not believe what my reason told me was derogatory to the character of the Supreme Being. And having no fear of the devil before mine eyes, I venture to call this a suggestion... bullshit, just kidding. Of reason. Instead of resting my weakness on the broad shoulders of the first seducer of my frail sex. It being once demonstrated, continues Rousseau, that man and woman are not, nor ought to be, constituted alike in temperament and character, it follows, of course, that they should not be educated in the same manner. In pursuing the directions of nature, they ought indeed to act in concert, but they should not be engaged in the same employments. The end of their pursuits should be the same, but the means they should take to accomplish them, and of consequence their tastes and inclinations, should be different. This is a couple of quotes back to back, I think. Yes, this is a big passage. That's all Rousseau. Rousseau continues, whether I consider the peculiar destination of the sex, observe their inclinations, or remark their duties, all things equally concur to point out the peculiar method of education best adapted to them. Woman and man were made for each other, but their mutual dependence is not the same. The men depend on the women only on account of their desires, the women on the men, both on account of their desires and their necessities. We could both subsist better without them than they with us. We could subsist better without them than they without us. Cat, I swear to God. For this reason, the education of the woman should always be relative to the men. To please, to be useful to us, to make us love and esteem them, to educate us when young, and take care of us when grown up, to advise, to console us, to render our lives easy and agreeable. These are the duties of women at all times. Fucking wild. And what they should be taught in their infancy. So long as we fail to recur to this principle, we run wide of the mark. And all the precepts which are given them contribute neither to their happiness nor our own. At any point is he just thinking like, well, this would be kind of weird if this were true. I mean, like, presumably his perfect view of the world, that what he happened to be born as is the dominant class, and the other class is completely subservient to him, and yeah. Anyway, girls are from the earliest infancy fond of dress, not content with being pretty. They are desirous of being thought so. We see... Oh, cat, please stop rubbing on the microphone. It's not a huge deal, but, like, it's just annoying me. Please. Okay, so girls, like, dress from infancy. Where were we? Not content with being pretty, they are desirous of being thought so. We see by... all their little airs, that this thought engages their attention, and they are hardly capable of understanding what is said to them. Fuck me. Before they are to be governed by talking to them of what people will think of their behavior. The same motive, however, indiscreetly made use of with boys, has not the same effect, provided they are let pursue their amusements at pleasure. They care very little of what people think of them. Time and pains are necessary to subject boys to this motive. As a parent, I've seen plenty of girls that don't give a fuck what people think of them from a pretty young age. Whencesoever girls deceive this first lesson, it is a very good one. As the body is born in a manner before the soul, our first concern should be to cultivate the former. This order is common to both sexes, but the object of that cultivation is different, which is weird. Why would that be so? Soul, like women have a different soul that needs different cultivation. In the one sex, it is the development of corporeal powers. In the other, that of personal charms. Not that either the quality of strength or beauty ought to be confined exclusively to one sex, but only that the order of cultivation of both is in that respect reversed. Women certainly require as much strength as to enable them to move and act gracefully, and men as much address as to qualify them to act with ease. Children of both sexes have a great many amusements in common, and so they ought. Have they not also many such when they are grown up? Each sex also has its peculiar taste, to distinguish in this particular. Boys love sports and noise and activity, to beat the drum, to whip the top, to drag about their little carts. Girls, on the other hand, are fonder of things of show and ornament, such as mirrors, trinkets, and dolls. The doll is the peculiar amusement of the females, from whence we see their taste plainly adapted to their destination. The physical part, I hope she tears them fucking apart. I mean, I assume this is, I don't know, it's kind of a weird thing where, like, presumably he would take the position that he as a man would not be raising children, but yet he has all these very very detailed thoughts about exactly how children are. The physical part of the art of pleasing lies in dress, and this is all which children are captivated to cultivate of that art. Gotta read that again. I think I read it incorrectly. The physical part of the art of pleasing lies in dress, and this is all which children are capacitated to cultivate of that art. Here then we see a primary propensity firmly established, which you need only to pursue and regulate. The little creature will doubtless be very desirous to know how to dress up her doll, to make its sleeve knots, its flounces, its headdress, etc. She is obliged to have so much recourse to the people about her for their assistance in these articles, that it would be much more agreeable to her to owe them all to her own industry. Hence we have a good reason for the first lessons that are usually taught these young females, in which we do not appear to be setting them a task, but obliging them, by instructing them in what is immediately useful to themselves. And in fact, almost all of them learn with reluctance to read and write, but very readily apply themselves to the use of their needles. They imagine themselves already grown up, and think with pleasure that such qualifications will enable them to decorate themselves. And did he ever think, like, maybe the social structure and the, constant putting people into specific categories and writing about shit like this, maybe that's forcing, a few more people to do this kind of stuff than otherwise would be. Because if you were to do something other than this, you would be, quote unquote abnormal. Okay. This is certainly only an education of the body, but that's the end of the Rousseau quote. I'm sorry. This is certainly only an education of the body, but Rousseau is not the only man who has indirectly said that merely the person of a young woman without any mind, useless animal spirits, come under that description, is very pleasing. To render it weak. To render it weak, and what some may call beautiful, the understanding is neglected, and girls forced to sit still, play with dolls, and listen to foolish conversations. The effective habit is insisted upon as an undoubted indication of nature. I know it was Rousseau's opinion that the first years of youth should be employed to form the body, though in educating Emilius, he deviates from this plan. Yet the difference between strengthening... Emilius is the boy I believe he mentioned earlier. Yet the difference between strengthening the body, on which strength of mind in a great measure depends, and only giving it an easy motion is very wide. Excuse me. Rousseau's observations, it is proper to remark, were made in a country where the art of pleasing was refined only to extract the grossness of vice. He did not go back to nature, or his ruling appetite disturbed the operations of reason, else he would not have drawn these crude inferences. In France, boys and girls, particularly the latter, girls, are only educated to please, to manage their persons, and regulate their exterior behavior, and their minds are corrupted at a very early age by the worldly and pious cautions they receive to guard them against immodesty. I speak of pastimes, the very confessions which mere children were obliged to make. And the questions asked by the holy men, I assert these facts on good authority, were sufficient to impress the sexual character in the education of society, was a school of coquetry and art. At the age of 10 or 11, nay, often much sooner, girls began to coquette, and talked unreproved of establishing themselves in the world by marriage. In short, they were treated like women, almost from their very birth, and compliments were listened to instead of instruction. These weakening the mind, nature was supposed to have acted like a stepmother when she formed this afterthought of creation. Not allowing them understanding, however, it was but consistent to subject them to authority independent of reason, and to prepare them for this subjection. He gives the following advice. Back to Rousseau, quote, girls ought to be active and diligent, nor is that all. They should also be early subjected to restraint. This misfortune, if it really be one, is inseparable from their sex, nor do they ever throw it off, but to suffer more cruel evils. They must be subject all their lives to the most constant and severe restraint, which is that of decorum. It is therefore necessary to accustom them early to such confinement, that it may not afterwards cost them too dear, and to the suppression of their caprices, that they may more readily submit to the will of others. Indeed, if indeed they be fond of being always at work, they should be sometimes compelled to lay it aside. Dissipation, levity, and inconstancy are faults that readily spring up from their first propensities. Dissipation, levity, and inconstancy. When corrupted or perverted too much by indulgence. To prevent this abuse, we should teach them, above all things, to lay a due restraint on themselves. The life of a modest woman is reduced by our absurd institutions to a perpetual conflict with herself. Not but it is just that this sex should partake of the sufferings which arise from those evils it hath caused us. I gotta read that again. Okay, so to prevent this abuse, so dissipation, levity, and inconstancy, we should teach them, above all things, to lay due restraint on themselves. So be restrained, never express yourself, never say anything funny or emotional. The life of a modest woman is reduced by our absurd institutions. So modest women not okay. To a perpetual conflict with herself. Not but it is just that this sex should partake of the sufferings which arise from those evils it hath caused us. Okay. And why is that's the end of the Rousseau quote. And why is the life of a modest woman a perpetual conflict? Good question. I should answer that this very system of education makes it so. Modesty, temperance, and self-denial are the sober offspring of reason. But when sensibility is nurtured at the expense of understanding, such weak beings must be restrained by arbitrary means, and be subjected to continual conflicts. But give their activity of mind a wider range, and nobler passions and motives will govern their appetites and sentiments. The common attachment and regard of a mother, nay, this is back to Rousseau. Excuse me. The common attachment and regard of a mother, nay, mere habit, will make her beloved by her children, if she do nothing to incur their hate. Even the constraint she lays them under, if well directed, will increase their affection instead of lessening it. Because a state of dependence being natural to the sex, they perceive themselves formed for obedience. End quote. This is begging the question, for servitude not only debases the individual, but its effects seem to be transmitted to posterity. Considering the length of time that women have been dependent, is it surprising that some of them hug their chains and fawn like the spaniel? These dogs, observes a naturalist, at first kept their ears erect, but custom has superseded nature, and a token of fear is becoming a beauty. For this same reason, adds Rousseau, women have, or ought to have, but little liberty. They are apt to indulge themselves excessively, which men never do, in what is allowed them. Addicted in everything to extremes, they are even more transported at their diversions than boys. The answer to this is very simple. Slaves and mobs have always indulged themselves in the same excesses when once they broke loose from authority. The bent bow recoils with violence when the hand is suddenly relaxed that forcibly held it, and sensibility, the plaything of outward circumstances, must be subjected to authority or moderated by reason. The results, he continues, from this habitual restraint, a tractableness, which women have occasion for during their whole lives, as they constantly remain either under subjection to the men, or to the opinions of mankind, and are never permitted to set themselves above those opinions. The first and most important qualification in a woman is good nature or sweetness of temper, formed to obey a being so imperfect as man, often full of vices, and always full of faults. She ought to learn, betimes, even to suffer injustice, and to bear the insults of a husband without complaint. It is not for his sake, but her own, that she should be of a mild disposition. The perverseness and ill nature of the women only serve to aggravate their own misfortunes. Can you imagine fucking reading this as a woman in 1790? Man. And the misconduct of their husbands, they might plainly perceive that such are not the arms by which they gain the superiority. Formed to live with such an imperfect being as man, they ought to learn from the exercise of their faculties the necessity of forbearance. But all the sacred rights of humanity are violated by insisting on blind obedience. Or, the most sacred rights belong only to man. The being who patiently endures injustice and silently bears insults will soon become unjust, or unable to discern right from wrong. Besides, I deny the fact, this is not the true way to form or ameliorate the temper, for, as a sex, men have better tempers than women, because they are occupied by pursuits that interest the head, as well as the heart, and the steadiness of the head gives a healthy temperature to the heart. People of sensibility have seldom good tempers. The formation of the temper is the cool work of reason. When, as life advances, she mixes with happy art, jarring elements. I never knew a weak or ignorant person who had a good temper, though that constitutional good humor and that docility which fear stamps on the behavior often obtains the name. I say behavior, for genuine meekness never reached the heart or mind, unless as the effect of reflection, and that simple restraint produces a number of piquant humors in domestic life. Many sensible men will allow, who find some of these gentle, irritable creatures very troublesome companions. Each sex, he further argues, should preserve its peculiar tone and manner. A meek husband may make a wife impertinent, but mildness of disposition on the woman's side will always bring a man back to reason, at least if he be not absolutely a brute, and will sooner or later triumph over him. Perhaps the mildness of reason might sometimes have this effect, but abject fear always inspires contempt, and tears are only eloquent when they flow down fair cheeks. Of what materials can that heart be composed, which can melt when insulted, and instead of revolting at injustice, kiss the rod? Is it unfair to infer that her virtue is built on narrow views and selfishness? Who can caress a man with true feminine softness the very moment he treats her tyrannically? Nature never dictated such insincerity, and though prudence of this sort be termed a virtue, morality becomes vague when any part is supposed to rest on falsehood. These are mere expedients, and expedients are only useful for the moment. Let the husband beware of thrusting too implicitly to this servile obedience. For if his wife can with winning sweetness caress him when angry, and when she ought to be angry, unless contempt had stifled a natural effervescence, she may do the same after parting with a lover. These are all preparations for adultery, or should the fear of the world or of hell restrain her desire of pleasing other men, when she can no longer please her husband, what substitute can be found by a being who was only formed by nature and art to please man? What can make her amends for this privation? Or where is she to seek for a fresh employment? Where find sufficient strength of mind to determine to begin the search, when her habits are fixed and vanity has long ruled her chaotic mind? But this partial moralist recommends cunning systematically and plausibly. Back to Rousseau. Quote, daughters should be always submissive. Their mothers, however, should not be inexorable. To make a young person tractable, she ought not to be made unhappy. To make her modest, she ought not to be rendered stupid. On the contrary, I should not be displeased at her being permitted to use some art, not to elude punishment in case of disobedience, but to exempt herself from the necessity of obeying. It is not necessary, so effectively, like, I'm not being disobedient. I have some reason that I can't obey the man. That's better than indicating you're disobeying. It is not necessary to make her dependence burdensome, but only to let her feel it. Subtlety is a talent natural to the sex, and as I am persuaded, all our natural inclinations are right and good in themselves. What about a woman's inclination to hit you over the head with a fucking frying pan for saying this shit? I am of the opinion this should be cultivated as well as the others. It is requisite for us only to prevent its abuse. Whatever is right, he then proceeds triumphantly to infer. Granted. Yet perhaps no aphorism ever contained a more paradoxical assertion. It is a solemn truth with respect to God. He reverentially, I speak, seized the whole at once, and saw its just proportions in the womb of time. But man, who can only inspect disjointed parts, finds many things wrong, and it is a part of the system, and therefore right, that he should endeavor to alter what appears to him to be so, even while he bows to the wisdom of his Creator, and respects the darkness he labors to disperse. The inference that follows is just, supposing the principle to be sound. Quote, the superiority of address peculiar to the female sex is a very equitable indemnification. The superiority of address peculiar to the female sex is a very equitable indemnification for their inferiority in point of strength. Without this, woman would not be the companion of man, but his slave. It is by her superior art and ingenuity that she preserves her equality, and governs him while she affects to obey. Woman has everything against her, as well our faults, as her own timidity and weakness. She has nothing in her favor but her subtlety and her beauty. Is it not very reasonable, therefore, she should cultivate both? Greatness of mind can never dwell with cunning or address. That's end quote of Rousseau. And this is Wollstonecraft. Greatness of mind can never dwell with cunning or address, for I shall not boggle about words when their direct signification is insincerity and falsehood. I agree. But content myself with observing that if any class of mankind be so created that it must necessarily be educated by rules not strictly deducible from truth, virtue is an affair of convention. How could Rousseau dare to assert, after giving this advice, that in the grand end of existence, the object of both sexes should be the same, when he well knew that the mind formed by its pursuits is expanded by great views swallowing up little ones, or that it becomes itself little? Men have superior strength of body, but were it not for mistaken notions of beauty, women would acquire sufficient to enable them to earn their own subsistence, the true definition and independence, and bear those bodily inconveniences and exertions that are requisite to strengthen their mind. Let us then, by being allowed to take the same exercise as boys, not only during infancy but youth, arrive at perfections of the body, that we may know how far the natural superiority of man extends. For what reason or virtue can be expected from a creature when the seed time of life is neglected? None. Did not the winds of heaven casually scatter many useful seeds in the fallow ground? Beauty cannot be acquired by dress and coquetry. I think it's coquette. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm not a good doofus. And coquetry is an art not so early and speedily attained. While girls are yet young, however, they are in a capacity to study agreeable gesture, a pleasing modulation of voice, an easy carriage and behavior, as well as to take the advantage of gracefully adapting their looks and attitudes to time, place, and occasion. Their application, therefore, should not be solely confined to the arts of industry and the needle. When they come to display their talents, whose utility is already apparent. For my part, this is another quote. For my part, I would have a young Englishwoman cultivate her agreeable talents in order to please her future husband with as much care and assiduity as a young Circassian cultivates hers, to fit her for the harem of an Eastern bashaw. End quote. To render women completely insignificant, he adds, quote, the tongues of women are very voluble. They speak earlier, more readily, and more agreeably than the men. Is he literally talking about a 1-year-old? Or just young kids? They are accused also of speaking much more. But so it ought to be. And I should be very ready to convert this reproach into a compliment. Their lips and eyes have the same activity, and for the same reason. A man speaks of what he knows, a woman of what pleases her, and one requires knowledge, the other taste. The principal object of a man's discourse should be what is useful, that of a woman's what is agreeable. There ought to be nothing in common between their different conversations but truth. It's confusing. So they're just telling the truth, but they're talking about different things. Okay, I understand. Quote continues, we ought not, therefore, to restrain the prattle of girls in the same manner as we should that of boys, with that severe question, to what purpose are you talking? But by another, which is no less difficult to answer, how will your discourse be received? In infancy, while they are as yet incapable to discern good from evil, they ought to observe it, as a law, never to say anything disagreeable to those whom they are speaking to. What will render the practice of this rule also the more difficult is that it must ever be subordinate to the former, of never speaking falsely or telling an untruth. And this includes women. Then you got to teach them to lie. Like then then half of their young adult life, you're just like, you need to be cunning and lie to everybody, because that's your strength. Okay. To govern the that's the end of the quote. To govern the tongue in this manner must require great address indeed, and it is too much practice both by men and women. Out of the abundance of the heart, how few speak. So few that I, who love simplicity, would gladly give up politeness for a quarter of the virtue that has been sacrificed to the equivocal quality which at best should only be the polish of virtue. But to complete the sketch, quote, it is easy to be conceived that if male children be not in a capacity to form any true notions of religion, those ideas must be greatly above the conception of females. It is for this very reason I would begin to speak to them the earlier on the subject. For if we were to wait till they were in a capacity to discuss methodically such profound questions, we should run. So if boys are too stupid at a young age to understand God and religion and stuff, girls are even stupider, so they won't get it, and so we should start teaching them even earlier. Is that the point he's making? We should run a risk of never speaking to them, and if we don't teach them early, they might never figure it out. Okay. Reason in women is a practical reason. Capacitating them artfully to discover the means of attaining a known end, but which would never enable them to discover that end itself. The social relations of the sexes are indeed truly admirable. From their union there results a moral person, of which woman may be termed the eyes, and man the hand, with this dependence on each other, that it is from the man that the woman is to learn what she is to see, and it is from the woman that man is to learn what he ought to do. If woman could recur to the first principles of things as well as man, and man was capacitated to enter into a similar minutiae as well as woman, always independent of each other, they would live in perpetual discord, and their union could not subsist. But in the present harmony, which naturally subsists between them, their different faculties tend to one common end. It is difficult to say which of them conduces the most to it. Each follows the impulse of the other, each is obedient, and both are masters. This is so confusing. Figuring out, okay, what does the man think, and how does he think it, and what is the woman? And they can't come together without discord, so they must think different things, I guess. This is crazy talk. Quote continues. As the conduct of a woman is subservient to the public opinion, her faith in matters of religion should, for that very reason, be subject to authority. Every daughter ought to be of the same religion as her mother. This is in italics, for emphasis, presumably. Every daughter ought to be of the same religion as her mother, and every wife to be the same religion as her husband. For though such religion should be false, that docility which induces the mother and daughter to submit to the order of nature takes away, in the sight of God, the criminality of their error. Footnote 1. What is to be the consequence if the mother's and husband's opinion should chance not to agree? An ignorant person cannot be reasoned out of an error, and when persuaded to give up one prejudice for another, the mind is unsettled. Indeed, the husband may not have any religion to teach her, though in such a situation she will be in great want of a support to her virtue, independent of worldly considerations. As they are not in a capacity, that's the end of the footnote. As they are not in a capacity to judge for themselves, now I'm talking about women again, they ought to abide by the decision of their fathers and husbands as confidently as by that of the church. Quote continues, as authority ought to regulate the religion of the women, it is not so needful to explain to them the reasons for their belief as to lay down precisely the tenets that they are to believe. For the creed, which presents only obscure ideas to the mind, is the source of fanaticism, and that which presents absurdities leads to infidelity. Ooh. Okay. Back to Wollstonecraft. Absolute, uncontroverted authority, it seems, must subsist somewhere. But is not this a direct and exclusive appropriation of reason? The rights of humanity have been thus confined to the male line from Adam downwards. Rousseau would carry his male aristocracy still further, for he insinuates that he should not blame those who contend for leaving woman in a state of the most profound ignorance, if it were not necessary in order to preserve her chastity and justify the man's choice, in the eyes of the world, to give her a little knowledge of men and the customs produced by human passions, else she might propagate at home without being rendered less voluptuous and innocent by the exercise of her understanding, excepting, indeed, during the first year of marriage, when she might employ it to dress like Sophia. Quote, her dress is extremely modest in appearance, and yet very coquettish in fact. She does not make a display of her charms, she conceals them. But in concealing them, she knows how to... It sounds like erotic fan fiction or something. But in concealing them, she knows how to affect your imagination. Everyone who sees her will say, there is a modest and discreet girl. But while you are near her, your eyes and affections will wander all over her person, so that you cannot withdraw them. And you would conclude that every part of her dress, simple as it seems, was only put in its proper place, in its proper order, to be taken to pieces by the imaginations. End quote. Is this modesty? Asks Wollstonecraft. Is this a preparation for immortality? Again, what opinion are we to form of a system of education when the author says of his heroine, quote, that with her, doing things well, is but a secondary concern. Her principal concern is to do them neatly, end quote. Secondary, in fact, are all her virtues and qualities. For respecting religion, he makes her parents thus address her, accustomed to submission, quote, your husband will instruct you in good time, end quote. After thus cramping a woman's mind, if, in order to keep it fair... I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing, because this is terribly fucked up. But it's crazy. Okay, after thus cramping a woman's mind, if, in order to keep it fair, he have not made it quite a blank, he advises her to reflect, that a reflecting man may not yawn in her company, when he is tired of caressing her. What? How much longer is this section on? Okay, section on Rousseau is coming to an end. Then we're going to talk about Dr. Fordyce's sermons. Whew. That bastard. Okay, so when he tires caressing her, okay. What has she to reflect about who must obey? And would it not be a refinement on cruelty, only to open her mind, to make the darkness and misery of her fate visible? Yet these are the sensible remarks, how consistent with what I have already been obliged to quote. To give a fair view of the subject, the reader may determine. Quote, they who pass their whole lives in working for their daily bread have no ideas beyond their business. I think it's a reference to the Lord's Prayer, I assume. Have no ideas beyond their business or their interest, and all their understanding seems to lie in their fingers' ends. This ignorance is neither prejudicial to their integrity nor their morals. It is often of service to them. Sometimes, by means of reflection, we are led to compound with our duty, and we conclude by substituting a jargon of words in the room of things. Our own conscience is the most enlightened philosopher. There is no need to be acquainted with Tully's offices to make a man of probity. Tully of Cicero, is that right? I gotta look that up. Tully. Tully isn't from Ireland? I thought Tully was like a Roman around. What? Cicero was. What am I thinking of? It doesn't matter. Additionally, Tully is sometimes used as a shortened version of the name Cicero. Whatever, I don't know what I'm talking about. And neither Google doesn't know what I'm talking about either, which is a bad sign. Okay, sorry. Tully's office is to make a man of probity, and perhaps the most virtuous woman in the world is the least acquainted with the definition of virtue. But it is no less true that an improved understanding only can render society agreeable, and it is a melancholy thing for a father of a family who is fond of home to be obliged to be always wrapped up in himself and have nobody about him to whom he can impart his sentiments. Besides, how should a woman void of reflection be capable of educating her children? How should she discern what is proper for them? How should she incline them to those virtues she is unacquainted with, or to that merit of which she has no idea? She can only soothe or chide them, render them insolent or timid. She will make them formal coxcombs or ignorant blockheads, but will never make them sensible or amiable." End quote. How indeed should she, when her husband is not always at hand to lend her his reason? Fair point. When they both together make out one moral being, a blind will, eyes without hands, would go a very little way, and perchance his abstract reason, that should concentrate the scattered beams of her practical reason, may be employed in judging of the flavor of wine, decanting on the sauces most proper for turtle, or most profoundly intent at a card table. He may be generalizing his ideas as he bets away his fortune, leaving all the minutiae of education to his helpmate or to chance. But granting that woman ought to be beautiful, innocent, and silly, to render her a more alluring and indulgent companion, what is her understanding sacrificed for? And why is all the preparation necessary only, according to Rousseau's own account, to make her the mistress of her husband a very short time? For no man ever insisted more of the transient nature of love. Thus speaks the philosopher, quote, "Sensual pleasures are transient. The habitual state of affections always loses by their gratification. The imagination which decks the objects of our desire is lost in fruition. Excepting the Supreme Being who is self-existent, there is nothing beautiful but what is ideal." End quote. But he returns to his unintelligible paradoxes again when he thus addresses Sophia. Quote, "Emilius, in becoming your husband, is become your master, and claims your obedience. Such is the order of nature when a man is married. However, to such a wife as Sophia, it is proper he should be directed by her. This is also agreeable to the order of nature. It is therefore to give you as much authority over his heart as his sex gives him over your person, that I have made you the arbiter of his pleasures. It may cost you, perhaps, some disagreeable self-denial, but you will be certain of maintaining your empire over him, if you can preserve it over yourself. What I have already observed also shows me that this difficult attempt does not surpass your courage. Would you have your husband constantly at your feet, keep him at some distance from your person? You will long maintain the authority in love, if you know but how to render your favors rare and valuable. It is thus you may employ even the arts of coquetry in the service of virtue, and those of love in that of reason." End quote. I shall close my extracts with a just description of a comfortable couple. Quote, "And yet you must not imagine that even such management will always suffice. Whatever precaution be taken, enjoyment will, by degrees, take off the edge of passion. But when love hath lasted as long as possible, a pleasing habitude supplies its place, and the attachment of a mutual confidence succeeds to the transports of passion. Children often form a more agreeable and permanent connection between married people than even love itself. When you cease to be the mistress of Emilius, you will continue to be his wife and friend. You will be the mother of his children. End quote. This is from Rousseau's Emilius, it says in a footnote. Children, he truly observes, form a much more permanent connection between married people than love. True. Beauty, he declares, will not be valued or even seen after a couple has lived 6 months together. Artificial graces and coquetry will likewise pall on the senses. Why then does he say that a girl should be educated for her husband with the same care as for an Eastern harem? I now appeal to the reveries of fancy and refined licentiousness, to a good sense of mankind, whether, if the object of education be to prepare women to become chaste wives and sensible mothers, the method so plausibly recommended in the foregoing sketch be the one best calculated to produce those ends. Will it be allowed that the surest way to make a wife chaste is to teach her to practice the wanton arts of a mistress, termed virtuous coquetry, by the sensualist who can no longer relish the artless charms of sincerity, or taste the pleasures arising from a tender intimacy, when confidence is unchecked by suspicion and rendered interesting by sense? It's a pretty fucking good point. Like, even if you grant Rousseau everything and claim that he's correct about like women being servants and whatever, is the way to teach them to do that to just make them dumb as a rock and cunning and also completely dependent on men? Because then you have a situation where it's like, okay, what's going to happen? Like, after 6 months, the shit wears off, like the honeymoon phase wears off. They're cunning, so that just, to me, indicates like a proclivity to cheat and not tell the truth. And they want to please men, but they're no longer pleasing their husband because that honeymoon phase is worn off. So what are they going to do? I think Wollstonecraft has already made that point. I don't think that's like, to be clear, I don't think that's a fair assessment of like what, women want to do or like their natural nature or anything like that. But even if his argument is true, it would be an odd way to accomplish the result. In fact, it would be complete bullshit, pretty clearly. Anyway. Oh, where was I? The man who can be contented to live with a pretty, useful companion without a mind has lost in voluptuous gratifications a taste for more refined enjoyments. He has never felt the calm satisfaction that refreshes the parched heart, like the silent dew of heaven, of being loved by one who can understand him. In the society of his wife he is still alone, unless when the man is sunk in the brute. Like, okay. The charm of life, says a grave philosophical reasoner, is, quote, sympathy. Nothing pleases us more than to observe in other men a fellow feeling with all the emotions of our own breast. End quote. But according to the tenor of reasoning, by which women are kept from the tree of knowledge, the important years of youth, the usefulness of age, and the rational hopes of futurity are all to be sacrificed to render women an object of desire for a short time. Besides, how could Rousseau expect them to be virtuous and constant when reason is neither allowed to be the foundation of their virtue nor truth the object of their inquiries? Good point. But all Rousseau's errors in reasoning arose from sensibility, and sensibility to their charms women are very ready to forgive. When he should have reasoned, he became impassioned, and reflection inflamed his imagination instead of enlightening his understanding. Even his virtues also led him farther astray, for, born with a warm constitution and lively fancy, nature carried him toward the other sex with such eager fondness that he soon became lascivious. Had he given way to these desires, the fire would have extinguished itself in a natural manner, but virtue, and a romantic kind of delicacy, made him practice self-denial. Yet, I'm pretty sure Rousseau married his legal guardian. If I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's true. I think I said his au pair in my first video, but I think it was his legal guardian, which is kind of similar, but... Yet, when fear, delicacy, or virtue restrained him, he debauched his imagination, and reflecting on the sensations to which fancy gave force, he traced them in the most glowing colors, and sunk them deep into his soul. Then he sought for solitude, not to sleep with the man of nature, or calmly investigate the causes of things under the shade where Sir Isaac Newton indulged contemplation, but merely to indulge his feelings. And so warmly has he painted what he forcibly felt, that, interesting the heart and inflaming the imagination of his readers, in proportion to the strength of their fancy, they imagine that their understanding is convinced when they only sympathize with a poetic writer, who skillfully exhibits the objects of sense, most voluptuously shadowed or gracefully veiled, and thus making us feel, whilst dreaming we reason, erroneous conclusions are left in the mind. Why was Rousseau's life divided between ecstasy and misery? Can any other answer be given than this? That the effervescence of his imagination produced both. But, had his fancy been allowed to cool, it is possible that he might have acquired more strength of mind. Still, if the purpose of life be to educate the intellectual part of man, all with respect to him was right. Yet, had not death led to a nobler scene of action, it is probable that he would have enjoyed more equal happiness on earth, and have felt the calm sensations of the man of nature, instead of being prepared for another stage of existence by nourishing the passions which agitate the civilized man. But peace to his manes, I wore not with his ashes, but his opinions. I wore only with the sensibility that led him to degrade woman by making her the slave of love. Cursed vassalage, first idolized, till love hot fire be over, then slaves to those who courted us before. Dryden. The pernicious tendency of all those books in which the writers insidiously degrade the sex whilst they are prostrate before their personal charms cannot be too often or too severely exposed. Let us, my dear contemporaries, arise above such narrow prejudices. If wisdom be desirable on its own account, if virtue to deserve the name must be founded on knowledge, let us endeavor to strengthen our minds by reflection, till our heads become a balance for our hearts. Let us not confine our thoughts to the petty occurrences of the day, or our knowledge to the acquaintance with our lovers' or husbands' hearts. But let the practice of every duty be subordinate to the grand one of improving our minds and preparing our affections for a more exalted state. Beware then, my friends, of suffering the heart to be moved by every trivial incident. The reed is shaken by the breeze and annually dies, but the oak stands firm and for ages braves the storm. Were we indeed only created to flutter our hour out to die, why let us then indulge sensibility and laugh at the severity of reason? Yet alas, even when we should want strength of body and mind, and life would be lost in feverish pleasures or wearisome languor, But the system of education which I earnestly wish to see exploded seems to presuppose what ought never to be taken for granted, that virtue shields us from the casualties of life, and that fortune, slipping off her bandage, will smile on a well-educated female, and bring in her hand an Emilius or Telemachus, whilst on the contrary, the reward which virtue promises to her votaries is confined, it seems clear, to their own bosoms, and often must they contend with the most vexatious worldly cares, and bear with the vices and humors of relations for whom they can never feel a friendship. There have been many women in the world who, instead of being supported by the reason and virtue of their fathers and brothers, have strengthened their own minds by struggling with their vices and follies, yet have never met with a hero in the shape of a husband, who, paying the debt that mankind owed them, might chance to bring back their reason to its natural dependent state and restore the usurped prerogative of rising above opinion to man.